This week we begin the story of Avraham Avinu. At this point, he's not yet Avraham, he's only Avram. His name will be changed a little bit later. And I'd like to make a couple of general comments about Avraham Avinu and then talk a little bit about the beginning of the parsha. We have two different images of Avraham Avinu. One emerges from, I think, the stories in the parsha and certainly the way Avraham is depicted in Chazal, and another emerges from the writings of the Rabbi. From the stories in the parsha, this week's parsha, next week's parsha, we get the picture of Avraham Avinu as being the exemplar of chesed, the exemplar of kindness. And this is a person who will extend himself for three unwashed Arabs. In fact, they turn out to be angels, but to the best of his knowledge, they were just three travelers, and he rolls out the red carpet for them. He risks his life, this is also in next week's parsha, to save his nephew Lot from the destruction of the city of stone. He prays for the wicked. And it's an amazing thing that Avraham Avinu, who is such a righteous person, we might have thought that he would gloat over the destruction of the wicked. He has some satisfaction that, okay, they're getting what they deserve. And yet we find him negotiating, arguing with God to spare the people of the wicked city of stone. So we have this image of Avraham Avinu, and this is amplified and discussed, that he's the exemplar of the midah of chesed, the midah of kindness. And in the mystical tradition, we have this association between the divine midah of chesed and Avraham's midah of chesed. That's one picture we have of Avraham Avinu. We have a different picture of Avraham Avinu from the Rambam. The Rambam depicts Avraham Avinu as a religious philosopher. And the Rambam describes the state of the world, the decline, how the world drifted away from monotheism, it fell into paganism, polytheism, and the world was on a process of spiritual degeneration until Avraham Avinu came along. And Avraham Avinu had such a masterful intellect that he was able to arrive at the truth of monotheism through his own speculation, through his own philosophizing, and was able to reestablish the true faith. So which was he? Was he the kindly gentleman, or was he the religious philosopher? Before we try to resolve that contradiction, let's talk a little bit about the religious revolution that Avraham Avinu sparked. Because according to the Rambam says that Avraham was in a world that was pagan. He had no teachers, he had no guides, and he arrived at the truth on his own. By the way, this is in contrast to the position of Rabbi Halevi in the Kuzari. Rabbi Halevi in the Kuzari says a surprising thing, that even as the world declined and sunk further and further into paganism, there still was a chain of tradition that stretched back to Adam Harishon. There were individuals who were still purely monotheistic, and Avraham Avinu had received that Masorah, had received that tradition. Now, Rabbi Halevi doesn't look at Avraham Avinu as a revolutionary, but the Rambam clearly has a different picture. The Rambam understands that Avraham Avinu arrived at something radically new on his own. What was the amazing insight of Avraham Avinu? Many say that Avraham Avinu stumbled across what is called the argument from design. In other words, he looked at the world and he saw how everything works perfectly. Intricate systems, complex systems, everything seems to be running in perfect order. Obviously, it is the consequence of design. If there is design, there must be an intelligent designer, and thus there must be a God who is the creator of all things. But this was Avraham Avinu's Amazing, amazing insight. And from that starting point, Avraham went further and further, and he expanded on his definition and embellished his definition, and he came to a full conception of God. Well, one of the things we believe about God is that God is totally self-sufficient. God has no needs. Nothing he does is for self-serving reasons. It's all altruistic. And that's a very reasonable position to take. I mean, if God is smart enough and powerful enough to create the world, he certainly should be able to handle his own needs. He doesn't make demands of anyone for self-serving reasons. So the question is, if God is really self-sufficient, why did he create a world? Just at this juncture in time. I mean, was there some need that God wanted to satisfy? So the answer, which the Mukubalim give, but undoubtedly this was the answer that Avraham Avinu himself gave, was that God created the world as an act of kindness. He wanted to bestow kindness upon beings, and for that he created them. Now, this is an amazing thing when you think about it. We respond to people's needs. Someone comes to the door and tells us a story that he's poor, he needs money, etc., etc., etc. We may respond to the need. But we're not waiting for people to knock on our doors. We're not hoping that people should knock on our doors. And we certainly wouldn't create needy people to be able to supply them with charity. But there is something in human experience which is analogous to this. I think the desire of people to have children is exactly this. Because why do people want to have children? They want to be able to give their love to a being. And therefore parents don't just adopt children that already need a home. They want to create children. And they give birth to children who can be the objects, the recipients of their love. And that's really the idea. HaKadosh Baruch Hu created a world that people should be the beneficiaries of his kindness. Now, exactly what that kindness is, so this concept is developed in the mystical works, is really not the experience of this world. This world is not so great. It's really the experience of the next world. And in order to maximize the bliss of the next world, God gives us the opportunity to earn it. And that is what this world is all about. This world is our opportunity to earn our bliss, which we'll experience after 120 years in the next world. But this is Avraham Avinu's conception of God. Now we know that a very, very important part of the avoda of a Jew is to emulate God, to try to be godlike, to act in a godlike manner. So when Avraham Avinu conceived of God as being motivated by chesed, altruism, the yearning to give, to share, Avraham understood that this is how he's meant to live his life. And therefore, everything we know about Avraham as a man of kindness, I don't think is a function of temperament or personality. It isn't just that he was that type of guy. He was a nice guy and he liked to help people, etc. This is his avoda. This, he understood, is what he has to be in order to emulate God. If God is kind in this way, I have to be kind in this way. And therefore, Avraham Avinu had this amazing capacity that when the service of God called upon him to be the exact opposite, he was able to do that. As we know that God gave him a command, it's really in next week's parsha, the command of the Akedah, to bring his son as a sacrifice. That is an act of seeming cruelty. And yet Avraham Avinu was willing to do without hesitation. Why? Because Avraham Avinu's conduct was not a function of his temperament. If he was the type of person who followed his nature, the person who is able to perform these wonderful acts of kindness probably is not suited to perform the seeming act of cruelty. Notice he was motivated by the yearning to serve God. So he perceived God as the exemplar of chesed, and therefore, for the most part, he acted that way. But on the other hand, when the divine command called upon him to act differently, he acted differently. So this is the dual image of Avraham Avinu. On the one hand, he is the people person, he's one who cares and shares and deals kindly with people. On the other hand, he is the rigorous thinker who restores the true faith. How old was Avraham Avinu when he came to this truth? So we have different versions in the Midrash. One version says that Avraham Avinu came to it when he was 3 years old. 3 years old. It's pretty amazing. Another version, he was 40 years old. And probably there's no machlokas, there's no dispute. Probably this was a process that he may have begun as a very young child and it became fully developed when he was 40 years old. Where does the Torah begin its story of Avraham Avinu? When Avraham Avinu was 75 years old. In other words, the Torah begins its story of Avraham Avinu with God calling Avram and saying, Lech Lecha, go forth from your birthplace to the land that I will show you. And it says that Avraham Avinu was 75 years old when he left Haran to go to the Holy Land. So the Torah really skips the early life of Avraham Avinu. And the Rambam, on the basis of Midrashim, fills in the background. He says that by this time, Avraham Avinu not only had come to the true faith, he had begun a mission to the world, and he already had reached out to hundreds and thousands of people. And the Torah glosses over that. It makes no mention of that. The story begins with God appearing to Avram. There's only the slightest of hints to one particular episode. There is a story that Avram was challenged by a man named Nimrod. Nimrod was king of a city called Ur-Kasdim. And Nimrod said, listen, either you'll worship my idols or I'll throw you into a fiery furnace. And Avraham Avinu was willing to sacrifice himself for his faith, and he was thrown into the furnace and was miraculously saved. And there's a reference to this place named Ur-Kasdim, which means the fire, the furnace of the Chaldeans. That's a reference to this one episode in the life of Avraham Avinu. Except for that, in the Chumash itself, we have no reference to anything that Avraham did in his early life until he is called upon Lech Lecha. Now again, there is a little bit of confusion because there may be some later episodes which Chazal say took place earlier, but really this is where the story begins, and that's the question. Why is this earlier part of his life ignored? Let me share with you a medrash. And there are two different ways of reading this medrash. One I think is the incorrect way, and the other is the correct way, so we'll see both. The medrash says the following, that the life of Avraham Avinu can be compared to the following. There once was a man who walked by a palace, and there was a bira dolekas. The palace was ablaze. What that means, we'll see in a moment. And Avraham walked by this palace, and he sees this magnificent palace ablaze, and he says, this is impossible. Efsher lebira below balabira. There cannot be a palace without a master of the palace. This can't be. How can there be a palace without a master of the palace? Immediately, God revealed himself to Avraham and said, Anihu balabira. I am the master of the palace, and Lech Lecha, go forward. Now, how is this? What does this medrash mean? What is this palace ablaze? So the conventional interpretation is it was ablaze in the sense that there was light coming from every window. Or every room was lit up. Every room was illuminated. It wasn't an abandoned palace. It was a palace that was apparently occupied. and everyone walked by would see there must be a family living here, must be a whole group of people living here. And Avraham Avinu said, wait a minute, there can't be a palace without a master of the palace. Which they take to mean as a metaphor for the world. In the same way that if you see a palace, you obviously come to the conclusion there must be an owner, a builder of the palace. So likewise, we live in a universe, which is a very, very well-developed universe. There must be a master of the universe. And immediately God appeared to him and said, I am the master of the universe. That's a very, very reasonable reading of the Medrash, except for one little problem, which is that it says here that as soon as Avraham Avinu had this insight, God appeared to him immediately and said, I am the master of the palace. But that doesn't make sense chronologically, because Avraham Avinu at the latest came to his understanding of God at the age of 40. And the divine revelation took place 35 years later when he was 75. So what is the Medrash saying immediately? Maybe in God's time frame, 35 years is just a second, but it doesn't seem to follow. The Medrash is telling us that as soon as Avraham Avinu came to this understanding, immediately God appeared to him. So it doesn't seem we're talking about something which took place 35 years later. So there's another interpretation of the Medrash, which goes like this: that the Bir Dolakas doesn't mean a palace that was illuminated. It means it was a palace that was burning down. The palace is burning down. And there's no one who seems to care. And Avraham Avinu says that doesn't make any sense. If there's a palace, there must be an owner to the palace. How is it possible the owner of the palace doesn't care? He's just going to let it burn down? He's oblivious. That makes no sense. To that, God revealed himself to Avraham and said, I am the master of the palace. I do care. And accordingly, Lech Lecha. Go forward. It was like this. That Avraham Avinu went one step further. See, until now, Avraham Avinu, perhaps through the argument of design, perhaps through other arguments, came to understand that the world was created, there was a creator, an intelligent creator, he created the world, and that he came to understand when he was, at latest, 40 years old. But now he took the argument a step further. If God created the world, he created the world for a reason. If he created the world for a reason, it would not make any sense for him to have abandoned the world. It wouldn't make sense that he create the world and said, now it's on its own, it runs on its own steam, and I'm disinterested, I don't care. That doesn't make any sense. For whatever reason God created the world, he certainly would have an interest in this perpetuation, in this continuity. So, in the same way as you see a building burning down, so the question you ask yourself is like this: there can't be a building without an owner. Someone had to build the building. Well, if he built the building, he built it for a reason. If he built it for a reason, why isn't he doing something about the fact that it's burning down? By the way, this is really the... you may know that there's a great issue which is raised nowadays, but it's not a new issue, of the apparent contradictions between science and religion. Right? We all know that this is an age-old problem. So, what exactly are the issues that underlie the debate? I mean, that's a lengthy discussion, but certainly one aspect of the debate is that scientists have one story of how the world came into existence, and the Bible has a different story as to how the world came into existence. So that's an apparent contradiction. In other words, you talk to the scientist, he'll tell you the Big Bang, 3 trillion years ago, life somehow started by itself, ultimately evolved into higher forms, and that's how we got here. And the man of religion reading the Bible tells you a different story, different chronology, different story, so there's an apparent contradiction. So, how do you resolve contradictions like this? That's a topic for another time. But one of the attempts is to try to read modern cosmology into the biblical text. So, for example, there'll be an approach that when it says that the world was created in 6 days, it doesn't really mean 6 days. It means 6 eras, 6 epochs. Each era may be 3 trillion years. And therefore, 6 days is 18 trillion years. There's no contradiction anymore. And when it says Bereshis, the world was created from the beginning, that could be a reference to the Big Bang. So therefore, it's totally consistent that Bereshis is the Big Bang and everything is really there. What the people that attempt this, I think, fail to understand is that the Big Bang is nothing more than an attempt to marginalize God. Meaning, if you take even one of the popular works on cosmology, Stephen Hawking's Brief History of Time, you see that there are things that science cannot answer. They have it all figured out about 3/10,000ths of a second after the Big Bang. From that point onward, they have it all figured out. How the world could unfold by natural means. But those first 3/10,000ths of a second, that they can't explain. Because nothing that happened at that very, very small moment is consistent with the laws of physics as we know them today. So it's a problem. So basically, they say that if we have to grudgingly accept that there's a creator, we're willing to accept that. But we marginalize him by saying that he had no role to play after those 3/10,000ths of a second. Beyond that point, everything unfolded in accordance with natural laws. So even if we have to grudgingly accept the creator, but we push him to the periphery, we push him out there. In other words, the commitment of scientists to the idea of the Big Bang is not only because this is the most reasonable explanation of origin. It's because the whole concept of a Big Bang is a marginalization of the supernatural. Right? We'll push it back to 15 trillion years ago, and beyond that, everything unfolds in accordance with natural laws. So to read it into the text is really an oxymoron of sorts. Because you can't read the marginalization of God into the Bible. Because if the Bible is telling you any message, the message it tells you is that God is alive and well, and he is involved on every level, on the macro level, on the micro level, in real time, up until this very day. And that's certainly the basic starting point of the Bible. So it's totally inconsistent with the Big Bang. Even if you put the Big Bang into the text, it's totally antithetical to the ideology of the Big Bang. That was Avraham Avinu's insight. Avraham Avinu said, it makes no sense to say that God created the world and then said, okay, the Big Bang is over, now let it unfold in accordance with its own way. That makes no sense. If God created the world, God is rational, he created it for a reason. For whatever reason he created it, he has an interest in its continuity. But Avraham Avinu saw something that the world was going down the drain very fast. And this is an amazing thing. As we already read in last week's Parsha, how the world degenerated to the point where God had to destroy it. Now we think, I think mistakenly, that that was a one-time thing. That after the flood, everything was going great. What do Chazal tell us? Chazal tell us, Asara Doiris mi Avraham ad Noach. There were 10 generations from Avraham until Noach. So why does the Torah tell us this? Lahodia kama erach apayim lefonov. This is to teach us how patient God is. That for 10 generations people were angering God until he brought the flood. So Rabbi Yonah, in his commentary, explains that there's a double meaning over here. When it comes to teach us how patient God is, it's really two things: how patient he is, but that even his patience has a limit. He's very patient. He waited 10 generations, but not 11 generations. Not 11 generations. There's patience, 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 up to a limit, but when the limit comes, then there's judgment. So this teaches us how patient God is. That he's patient for a very long time, but there's a limit. And Rabbi Yonah says, as an aside, and this is a very great consolation for us. He says, we've been in Golus, we've been in exile for hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years. And keep in mind, Rabbi Yonah was writing 700 years ago. So by now it's even longer than that. And we think that perhaps we should give up hope. He says, no. He says, God is very patient, even with the enemies of the Jewish people. He's patient, 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 but there's a limit to his patience. Beyond the point, there'll be judgment, and there'll be redemption. So that's the first Mishnah. Continues the next Mishnah. Asara doros minayach ad Avraham. There were 10 generations from Noach until Avraham. So why does the Torah tell us that? Lo dia kama erech apayim lefanav. It teaches how patient God is. Because all the generations were, again, angering God. But it ends differently. We'll see why in a moment. But the implication is, the parallel is, that really the same type of degeneration that had taken place in the 10 generations from Avraham until Noach was taking place again in the 10 generations from Noach until Avraham. In other words, it looked like
Adam to Noach.
The same degeneration in the 10 generations from Adam till Noach was taking place again in the 10 generations from Noach until Avraham. In other words, really, the time was ripe for another Mabul. Now you'll object and say, wait a minute, didn't God swear that there wouldn't be another Mabul? So I think we pointed out, I don't know if it was in this class or past years, we pointed out that there was a promise not to destroy the world. There wouldn't have been a Mabul that would have destroyed animals, that would have destroyed plants, but there could have been some catastrophe that would have destroyed people, the people that were deserving of punishment. And it seems from the Mishnah that what Chazal are telling us is that the world was ripe for another calamity. But what happened instead? It says in that Mishnah, Ad Sheba Avraham, until Avraham came, and Avraham Avinu took the reward that would have been given to everybody. Meaning, if the entire population of the world would have devoted itself to the service of God, they would have received an immense reward. That reward was all given to Avraham. And Rabbi Yonah in his commentary explains that the difference between Noach's time and Avram's time was exactly this. Noach was righteous enough to save himself. But he couldn't carry the ball for all of humanity. And Avram was so great that he was able to save the entire world. He was able to carry the ball for everybody. Now I always give the mashal as follows. Let's say I'm a teacher, I walk into my classroom, the classroom is a mess. And I say, I refuse to teach in this classroom until you clean it up. And I say, I'm going to walk out now, I'll come back in 5 minutes. If the room isn't spotless, I'm sending all of you to the principal's office. It's pretty tough, right? Make it the principal's burden. That's what I said. So, I walk in the room 5 minutes later, the place is still a mess. No one lifted a finger. So what happens? Everyone gets sent to the principal's office. What happens if I come back 5 minutes later, the room is spotless? But I find out that in fact, no one lifted a finger except one kid. Because everyone else just sat there. But one kid decided to take it seriously, and he got up and he cleaned up the whole room, just himself. But the other 19 kids didn't do anything. But I come back, do the 20 kids get sent to or do the 19 get sent to the principal's office? I didn't do anything. I shouldn't be punished. Because the one saved everybody else. He picked up the slack for everybody else. And that's the difference in Avraham and Noach. In other words, the generation was just as bad. that really the time was ripe for another Mabul. Whereas Noach was righteous enough to save himself, he could not carry the burden for everybody. Avraham Avinu was able to carry the burden for everybody. Now, that of course is in hindsight. But let's put ourselves in Avraham Avinu's shoes. What does he see going on before God calls him? Avraham sees the world is burning down. There's a degeneration, there's a decline, there's a corruption. The whole world is a mess. It looks like there's going to be another Mabul. And God is not apparently doing anything about it. He's not doing anything to save the world. He's not doing anything to destroy the world. Right? So it looks like that God has lost interest. So to that everyone says, this makes no sense. God created a world. How is it possible the world is burning down and he's oblivious? Even if you bring another Mabul, at least that would show that he cares. You know, it's an important thing to know. That no children like to get punished. But when parents punish their children, at least they realize they have parents. But imagine a child who does whatever he wants and there's no reaction at all. He's a neglected child. So sooner or later he'll realize what's going on. I don't have a parent. They don't care what I do. I mean, maybe children would like that. But after a while, they realize it. I won't have parents. So Avraham Avinu is puzzled. What is going on over here? So Bereshis says, wait a minute. What, you think I'm doing nothing? He says, no. I have a plan. I have a plan to save the world. What's the plan to save the world? Lech Lecha. That's your calling. I'm calling on you. Through your efforts, through the nation that you're going to establish, the world is going to be saved. Don't have oblivious. I am the owner, and this is my plan, Lech Lecha. That's the Medrash says. Immediately, as soon as Avraham Avinu came to this awareness, God revealed himself to Avraham. Now, the important thing to understand is this: then why did God wait so long? I think this points to a truth which is a universal truth. If you want someone to work towards the solution of a problem, you can't recruit him until that person on his own realizes there's a problem. In other words, if I tell you, there's a big problem that we have to tackle, and you don't see it as a big problem, you're not going to devote a lot of effort to solving that problem. If I would tell you, we have a very, very big crisis facing the Jewish community here in Toronto. What's the big crisis? The crisis is that people are not very careful about washing their hands in the morning. And I'm going to ask you, you have to quit your day job, and devote yourself, 18 hours a day to addressing this problem. We're going to have meetings and campaigns, and we're going to advertise, and we're going to have rallies, and we're going to nip this problem in the bud, and we're really going to work hard. And it's going to entail sacrifice. You're going to have to give up, your lifestyle, because you're not going to be able to afford it, because you have to give up your career. But it's going to be worth the sacrifice, because this problem has to be addressed. You're going to look like I'm crazy. Like that problem calls upon me to sacrifice everything I have, everything I do. Aren't there better ways, easier ways? I mean, is it really such a bad problem? You're not going to pick yourself up and be moser nefesh and sacrifice until you realize there's a problem here. So if God would appear to Avraham and tell Avraham, you should know that the world is right now in a state of spiritual degeneration, decline, we have to nip this in the bud, it's not going to happen. Avraham Avinu is not going to pick himself up and sacrifice to address this problem. It has to be that Avraham Avinu himself understands it. Never God waited. God waited until it became apparent to Avraham. And Avraham then saw the world as a palace burning down. This can't be. This is a catastrophe. God has to respond. So God said, now that you've noticed, now this is your calling. Your calling is Lech Lecha. And Lech Lecha really is the calling of Avraham Avinu to change the world. Now, it's important to know that Avraham Avinu was already doing his fair share to change the world. Because as we said, as Rambam tells us, that he already was preaching and teaching to groups in the hundreds, in the thousands, the truth of God's existence, morality, MS, the truth. What really changed at this point? I'd like to offer a conjecture. This is something I said in the class many, many, many years ago. And I'll just let you know something very personal. That very often, I give classes, and I can't remember the next day what I said. This happens to be that I don't have the greatest memory, but sometimes, on those rare occasions, I think I stumble across something which has some truth to it, then it sticks. So this is an idea. It's a conjecture, but I think there's some truth to the conjecture. Now, it's very interesting. We think the Torah tells us a lot about Avraham Avinu, but when we try to reconstruct the chronology of his life, there are some very serious problems. For example, in last week's parsha, in the Parshas Noach, it says the following: that Avram and his wife, nephew, etc., traveled along with his father Terach from Ur Kasdim to travel towards Eretz Yisrael. They left Ur Kasdim to travel towards Eretz Yisrael. And they stopped in a place called Haran, which seems to be halfway, the midpoint, and that's where Terach died. And that seems to be the departure point for Avram's journey, because when HaKadosh Baruch Hu appeared to Avram and said, Lech Lecha, at that point it says that Avraham Avinu was 75 years old when he left the city of Haran. So we get the impression that the origination point was back in Ur Kasdim, which is the far east, and they were traveling towards Eretz Yisrael. Interestingly, even before God appeared to Avram, they were, for some reason, going towards Eretz Yisrael. They stopped at Haran, and they settled there. And in Haran, God appeared to Avram and told him to go further. The problem is this. The problem is that when God appeared to Haran, to Avram in Haran, he says, Lech Lecha, go forward, me'artzecha, from your land, u'moladecha, and your birthplace. Now, it doesn't seem that Avram was born in Haran. It seems that Avram was born in Ur Kasdim. That later they traveled from Ur Kasdim to Haran, and from Haran, Avram went down himself to Eretz Yisrael. So why does God tell Avram in Haran, leave your birthplace? He had already left his birthplace long before. So Rashi skirts around the question and says that what God meant was distance yourself even farther from your birthplace. And of course he wasn't in his birthplace. He had left long before, but distance yourself even farther. Go farther west from your birthplace. The Ramban, in last week's parsha, says, I will reveal to you the secret. I'll reveal to you the secret. Avram really was born in Haran. And he says that if you study the biblical geography, you certainly get that impression, because we know that Noach had three sons, Shem, Ham, and Yafes. And we know that Avram was a descendant of Shem. And we know that the concentration of the descendants of Shem was not there in Ur Kasdim. Ur Kasdim was territory that belonged to Ham. Haran belonged to Shem. And therefore, Avram undoubtedly was born here. But then what happened was that at some point, Terach and his family moved east to Ur Kasdim, and then, as the Midrashim say, they were forced to flee, and they ran away, and they figured, well, if you're going to run away from Ur Kasdim, which is in the far east, Mesopotamia, what's the farthest place you can run? Is Eretz Yisrael, which is in the west. So they were running. They got as far as Haran. At that point, they felt they were safe, and they stopped. And that was a very comfortable place, because that's really where they started from in the first place. Where they really had returned home to Haran. And at that point, God appeared to Avraham and said, leave your birthplace and go to Eretz Yisrael. So the Ramah says this is the secret. But even having revealed the secret, we don't get much of a picture as to what is the purpose of all this migration. Well, what do we know from the Midrashim? We know from the Midrashim that Avram's father was in what business, what industry? He was in the religious articles business. He manufactured idols. And Avram was in the opposite business. Avram was in the business of being anti-idolatry. So it made perfect sense from both perspectives to go to Ur-Kasdim. Ur-Kasdim was the area, this is where Nimrod was the king. Nimrod, we know, Chazal tell us, was named Nimrod because he was Makiris Boro. He recognized his creator, Umiskaven Nimrod Bo. And his intent was to defy him, to rebel against him. Because Nimrod was not a person who fell into idolatry because of desire, temptation, lust. He was a rebel against the authority of God. He was defiant. This was a matter of principle. This was really the center of idolatry for the world. This place called Ur-Kasdim. So Terach goes there because that's where business is, and Avram goes there because that's where business is. And they find themselves in the city. Well, Avram is arrested for his anti-religious work, and he is sentenced to be sent into the furnace. According to the Midrashim, Terach was also implicated. He was guilty by association. After all, this was the father of Avram. It's true that really this was one of those areas where father and son did not see eye to eye, but that didn't make much of a difference. Because Terach was also in danger. So when Avram was miraculously saved from the furnace, they realized that they were in danger here. They had to run away, and they were going to run as far as they could go. So where did they go? What's the farthest place you can go? The farthest place you go is Eretz Yisrael. But they didn't have to go that far, because once they got to Haran, they felt safe. They had run away far enough, and they settled back in Haran. And Haran was very, very, very comfortable. Now, it's an interesting thing. The Torah tells us that Avraham Avinu was able to amass many, many followers in Haran. Because it says that when he traveled to Eretz Yisrael, it says in this week's parsha, he took along with him Hanefesh Asher Asu B'Charan, the souls that he made in Haran, his converts, his disciples, he took with him. Which means that in Haran, Avraham Avinu was very, very successful. Apparently in Ur-Kasdim, he was a terrible failure. In other words, his attempts to battle idolatry, to battle paganism, not only were unsuccessful, not only could he not persuade them, he almost got himself killed in the process. Now, what is the explanation? Why was he more successful here than there? Well, the answer is very simple, because if we look at these various groups, we have the sons of Chum, who lived in Ur-Kasdim. We have the sons of Shem, who lived in Haran. And we know from Parshas Noach there was a very big difference between the various sons of Noach. The three sons of Noach really are three archetypes. In other words, Chum means warmth. Warmth. So this is a person who's interested in sensual gratification, pleasure. And we know that one of the great attractions of idolatry was the licentiousness, which was associated with idolatry. It wasn't a philosophical attraction. It was, Chazal tell us that lo ovdu Yisrael avodah zara lahat lehem arayos. Even when the Jews fell into idolatry, it was only to permit for themselves illicit sexual practices. I mean, that was really the engine which made idolatry and paganism so attractive. So that's the area of Chum. Chum, this was the group of people whose motive in life was that type of sensual gratification. That's the people of Chum. Yefes, the other son, yefes means beauty. These were people who had a sense of the aesthetic, and it's important to know that aesthetics are neutral. In other words, you can use the sense of the aesthetic to beautify that which is worthy. You can use the sense of the aesthetic to beautify that which is corrupt. So we know that Yefes received the bracha. Yafta l'kim le'yefes, that God gave the blessing of beauty to Yefes. The yishkon ba'ol le'shem. But the blessing was that it should serve the tense of shame, not the tense of cham. Shame, the word shame means name. And name means the essence of something. And the verse explains, in the context of Noach's 3 sons, it's the spiritual essence. And in fact, all spiritual movements grew from the sons of Shem. All modern religions, like Christianity, Islam, Judaism, in other words, derived from the descendants of Shem. So Avraham Avinu, it's not a surprise, he was very unsuccessful in Ur Kasdim, which was the stronghold of the sons of Shem, and was very successful in Haran, which is the sons of Cham, and very successful in Haran, which is the stronghold of the descendants of Shem. Now, at this time, what was Eretz Yisrael? So, without going into details, but this is something which also comes from the parsha, that Eretz Yisrael was a battleground. Eretz Yisrael originally was occupied by the sons of Shem, but it was being conquered by the sons of Cham. This is something that Rashi makes reference to various points of the parsha. So when God tells Avram to go to Eretz Yisrael, this is not going to be a great success. In other words, this is going to be counterproductive for Avram's missionizing. In other words, in Haran, this was fertile soil for his efforts. But to go to Eretz Yisrael is going to be very slim pickings. And in fact, the Rambam writes that Avraham had gathered these hundreds and thousands of disciples until he arrived at Eretz Yisrael. And the implication is that once he arrived in Eretz Yisrael, he was much less successful. Again, why? Because his field of influence, his sphere of influence in Haran was among the sons of Shem. But back in Eretz Yisrael, he was dealing with the sons of Cham, and these people were not receptive. He already had experience with them back in Ur Kasdim, where he barely escaped with his life. So the question is, why is God telling him to do this? And this is the important thing, that what God was telling Avraham with Lech Lecha is something which is very, very radical, which is that the future, your success, is not going to be through the establishment of a faith community, but it'll be through the establishment of a blood community. And let's understand what that means. Avraham Avinu was proselytizing, he was converting, he was preaching, he was teaching, he was reaching out to the public. These were his disciples. They were not his children, not his biological children. They were his students. So Avraham Avinu was creating a community of believers. And he was very successful in that. The Jewish people is not a community of believers. The Jewish community is a family. It's a family. And I'll point out some interesting things that bear this out. As we know, we speak of all sorts of Jews. There are Messianic Jews, Christian Jews, Buddhist Jews, atheist Jews, all sorts of Jews. Now, but you never hear people speaking of Buddhist Christians or atheist Christians or Muslim Christians. That you never hear. Why not? If there are atheist Jews, why aren't there atheist Christians? The answer is very simple. Because what it means to be a Christian is to profess to the Christian religion, to profess to Christianity. If you are an atheist, you are not a Christian. No such thing as an atheist Christian. No such thing as a Muslim Christian. No such thing as a Christian for Moses. It can't be. Right? If you are a Christian, that means you profess to Christianity. If you don't profess to Christianity, you're not a Christian. But yet, we're very comfortable speaking of atheist Jews and Jews for Jesus and Buddhist Jews, Hindu Jews. Why? Because what it means to be a Jew is to be a member of the family. So in every family, there are members in good standing, there are black sheep of the family, you have that, right? But you're a member of the family, nevertheless. In other words, what Avraham Avinu was being called upon to do was to give up his idea. Because your idea is you think that you're going to change the world by creating a faith community. No, you're going to do it by creating a blood community. That means that the sphere of your activity is going to narrow. In other words, until now you've been dealing with the hundreds, with the thousands, with converts, with disciples. Now you're going to be working towards the establishment of a family. You haven't had children until this point. But now you're going to have children. You're going to have a child. And Avraham Avinu had one child. I mean, he had two children. Yishmael was ultimately sent away, but finally he had one child, Yitzchak, who was his successor. And that's it. And all Avraham Avinu's efforts were directed to this one child. That was the thrust of his activity, to establish this nation. And God said it is going to be through that you are going to bring truth and morality to all mankind. Not through your disciples, not through your students, but through your children. And it's an amazing, amazing thing that it says in Svarim, what happened to all these converts of Avraham Avinu? He converted so many people and he inspired them. What happened? They all disappeared. They all disappeared. Because when your connection is through an idea, ideas change. So Avraham Avinu's students were very passionate about these ideas, but when they were transmitted to the next generation and the next generation and the next generation, these ideas tended to fade away. They didn't have any staying power. Because our connection to our heritage is the connection of blood, it's the connection of family. That's something which has a permanence, it has a lasting nature. And God was telling Avraham, this is what you have to do. This is what you have to do to fulfill your purpose. And this is a very, very big challenge because, imagine a person who is very, very successful at what he's doing, and now he's told that you're going to have to be much more limited in terms of the number of people you're reaching. I'll just give you an analogy, just a story that it's not even as fantastic as Avraham Avinu. You all heard of the great Shimshon Hirsch. Shimshon Hirsch was called in his middle years to become the rabbi of the breakaway Orthodox community in Frankfurt. Frankfurt was a city where the established Jewish community had been taken over by the reformers. And there was a small breakaway movement that wanted to establish an independent Orthodox community. How many people was it comprised of? It is said that at the time there was not a minyan. Not a minyan. Now the famous Shimshon Hirsch was the chief rabbi of Moravia, one of the German states. It was a very, very, very distinguished position. There were thousands of Jews under his jurisdiction. And these 7 or 8 people in Frankfurt had the chutzpah, like the audacity. They said, we need a rabbi. So normally, a group of 7 people needs a rabbi. Who do they call? They call some yeshiva, send us a bocher, a young man, to be our rabbi, right? They sent this letter to one of the most powerful rabbinic figures in Germany, and they said, you're the only one that can do it. We need you to be our rabbi. And the amazing thing is he did it. He understood that's what the hour called for. And he gave up this distinguished, influential position to become the rabbi of a group of 7, 8 people. But ultimately he was the savior of German Jewry. It's an amazing, amazing thing. But imagine what his wife said. I mean, you're going to give up like all you're doing and all your influence and your teaching and your hundreds of followers to go to this place and talk to the 4 walls and these 7 people. But he had the foresight to understand that is exactly what he had to do. That's what the hour demanded. And it was the same thing. In other words, we know that Chazal tell us that Avraham Avinu was tested with 10 tests. 10 tests. 10 tests. So what was the first test? The first test was Lech Lecha. God told Avraham Avinu, pick yourself up and go. So you have to ask yourself, what was the big test over here? God appeared to him. God spoke to him. Right? And God said, go. I'm going to make you a great nation. I'm going to bless you. You'll have wealth. You'll have children. You'll have everything. You're not going to suffer at all. So what's the big test? What's the challenge? The challenge is that Avraham Avinu was promised wealth and promised children, but would his life have any meaning if he make this move? He was essentially being called upon to give up his life's work. And God told him, no, don't worry. What you knew until now is unimportant. Now, this is the real thing. This is the real thing. You're going to found a great nation. And this nation will bring the truth and morality to all mankind. It's very hard to buy into God's vision if you don't see it yourself. But he took God's word and he went. And that's Lech Lecha. It's an amazing thing. It's not just a question of giving up security. He wasn't giving up a cushy position, a six-figure salary. He was giving up something which is ultimately more meaningful, which is the very meaning of his life, because he understood that whatever he was able to accomplish in Haran, he would not be able to accomplish in Eretz Yisrael. Of course, Eretz Yisrael is, in a spiritual sense, it's the loftiest place. It would be the best place for him, but it's not where he would do his best work. But he went anyway. Now, I just want to go back and answer the one question, which is that why is it the story of Avraham begins here? What happened to those earlier years? Well, first of all, those earlier years really make no difference for eternity. That's really the point. The Torah is a record of that which we need to know for eternity. There's nothing that Avraham did before this point had any permanence. Now, those converts, those disciples, they disappeared. So therefore, they're totally irrelevant. It's a nice thing. Yeah, Avraham preached to thousands of people. The Torah is not the record of man's quest for philosophic truth. The Torah is the record of man's quest for a relationship with God. And that begins with the revelation. Now, Avraham Avinu, until this point, was a religious philosopher. And he had worked out positions, and he was even willing to give up his life for the truth, which is a very commendable thing. But it's not a relationship. There can't be a relationship with God until there's revelation, until there's communication. So Avraham Avinu's life until this point was the life of the philosopher. He had strong positions, strong convictions, willing to sacrifice for them. That's not what the Torah is interested in. The Torah is interested in recording the relationship, the ongoing relationship with God and man. That begins with Lech Lecha. That begins with the first revelation, when God speaks to Avraham for the first time. So that's why the Torah begins with this point. And interestingly, the Torah doesn't tell us at all why Avraham was chosen. Certainly Avraham had a great resume up until this point. But that's not the point. What confirms or what justifies God's choice of Avraham Avinu is not what Avraham Avinu did until this point. It's what Avraham Avinu does after this point. And therefore the past record has no relevance at all, not even as a justification for God's choosing Avraham. God's choosing Avraham is justified not by what he did before, but what he does afterward. And therefore these stories that are told in this week's parsha, next week's parsha, the week after that, the stories of Avraham Avinu, they are the justification for God's selection of Avraham Avinu. And therefore the Torah doesn't begin with the background. It begins the story just at this point. So these are some thoughts about Avraham Avinu. I'll tell you, he's a fantastic person. You just think about Avraham Avinu, you just can't get him out of your head. I mean, Moshe Rabbeinu, of course, is Moshe Rabbeinu, but Avraham Avinu is just a first. You can't take it away from him. So hopefully we'll be inspired by these stories this week. And we like Avraham Avinu. And sometimes we have to stand up for our convictions. Firmly, without hesitation. And for that, Avraham Avinu certainly is a role model. Okay, so we'll see you all next week. Thank you for coming.